are listening to Stories from Palestine podcast, a podcast recorded in Palestine and about Palestine. My name is Crystal. I am originally from the Netherlands and I am married to a Palestinian. We live in Beit Safafa between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and we run Singer Cafe and Al Jisr Bar in Beit Sahur. Before moving to Palestine in 2013, I worked as a teacher and tour guide in the Netherlands. I have a degree in history and in tour guiding and many years of tour guiding experience. Due to the COVID pandemic, tourism in Palestine came to a complete halt, and that's why I started Stories from Palestine podcast in August 2020. This is the second year of the podcast, with every week on Monday a new episode about the history and heritage of Palestine, as well as the reality of life today. I hope you will enjoy today's episode. This week's episode is a solo episode. I want to tell you about the archaeological site of Megiddo that I finally visited during a 3-day trip I did with two of my friends in order to prepare for the exam of the Ministry of Tourism that still the date is not announced, but we keep preparing and reading for it. I was really looking forward to visiting this site because of its long and interesting history, and visiting it, I was definitely not disappointed. This is Tel Megiddo, or Tel el Mutaselim in Arabic, the Mount of the Governor, and it is located in the Jezreel Valley, or in Arabic, Marj bin Amer, and actually in Greek language it is the Valley of Esdraelon, which we read in ancient Greek texts. Megiddo is an archaeological site with 25 layers of different civilizations. Now, I have mentioned in previous episodes that they call this a tel when cities were built and were destroyed, or they fell into ruins after earthquakes, and then the mud bricks would weather down under the rain, and then new rulers would come and new inhabitants would rebuild the city, and they would build new houses and buildings on top of the old houses. And sometimes they even reused some of the stones into the new buildings. And then when they were attacked and their city was destroyed, then they would build new cities over the houses and buildings and so on. And that is what creates a tel. So it's not a natural mountain, it is a man-made mountain, and we see superimposed cities. And today, when archaeologists dig down into the tel, they find remains of many different civilizations in the different layers or the different strata that they uncover. And Megiddo is a very special site. Together with Jerusalem, it is one of the places where most battles were fought. The city was besieged and destroyed and rebuilt over 20 times. And the reason for that is its very important strategic location, probably the most strategic location in the ancient world. Megiddo is overlooking the very fertile valley, the Jezreel Valley, the Marj bin Amer Valley. And this valley is surrounded by hills and mountains, and it's like a fertile oasis. It is very suitable for agriculture. But not only that, it is also very important as part of the ancient trade route between Egypt and Mesopotamia. So this route connected the two big empires of that time through this valley. It was over the coastal road that became known as the Via Maris, the road of the sea, that people would come from Egypt to go to Mesopotamia. For example, imagine you are a trader coming from Egypt and you want to go to Damascus, for example. Then you would take the route along the coast up north. This is flat land. It's easy to travel, much easier to travel than a mountain ridge. And there were plenty of water supplies here from springs. But then if you go north, you will hit the Carmel Mountains. And in order to avoid having to climb over the mountains, you would head east through some of the valleys, and then you would reach the Jezreel Valley. And from there, you continue through the valley towards the Lake of Galilee, and then around the Lake of Galilee to continue to Damascus. Now, in order to reach the Jezreel Valley, the quickest route was to go through the Aruna Pass. And this was a very narrow passage of about 2 meters in width. And once you traveled through this pass, then you would see the big city of Megiddo. And the city controlled the whole region. So it's not a surprise that this city was always the target of new upcoming rulers who wanted to control the Via Maris trade route. The first battle that was recorded in details happened in the 15th century before Christ. This battle was recorded in the temple of Amon-Re in Karnak in Egypt in hieroglyphic writings. And the story tells that Pharaoh Tuthmose III had heard about a big number of Canaanite kings who were making a coalition to rebel against the Egyptian rulers. The leader of the coalition was the king of Kadesh, and he had gathered a large army of chieftains from the different city-states in Canaan, and they had an estimated number of 15,000 soldiers. They were stationed at Megiddo, and then they got the news that the Pharaoh was on his way with an army of between 10 to 20,000 men, with cavalry, with chariots, and they decided to wait for him at the southern pass at Tanakh. So when Tuthmose arrived close to the Jezreel Valley and close to Megiddo, he had to decide which route he will take to reach Megiddo. He could take the northern route from Tel Yokneam, or he could take the southern route from Tanakh. And both of these were maybe longer, but they were easier to travel. Or he could take that middle route, that Aruna pass, that very small and narrow pass. And today this is called Wadi Ara. Now, if he took the narrow pass, that meant that his army had to walk part of it single file. So they would have to disassemble the chariots, the soldiers, the horses, they all had to walk one after the other. And if the enemy was waiting on the other end of the pass, then they would all be slaughtered to pieces. So the army generals advised Tuthmose to take the longer route. But Tuthmose sent some scouts through the pass, and after receiving information from them, he decided that he would do the unexpected thing. He said, if my army generals advise me not to take this route, that means that the enemy will probably also not expect me to come from this narrow pass. So he led his army through the Aruna Pass. It must have taken them all day. But when they arrived to the other side, they had a clear view of Megiddo, and there were no enemy armies waiting for them. The enemy armies were waiting on other points. So they set up their camp. They stayed that night, and the next morning, Tuthmose decided to attack the army camps of the Canaanites. And now Tuthmose made one mistake, because he let his soldiers plunder the camps. They plundered it for chariots and for armor, but even though this was a great loss for the Canaanites, it gave their generals time to rejoin the defenders inside the city walls of Megiddo, which meant that Tuthmose lost the chance to quickly capture Megiddo, and by allowing his men to plunder, that meant that he had to spend the 7 next months to besiege the city of Megiddo until he could finally capture it. He also captured several other cities in the region, and he restored his control over the area. And with his own words, Tuthmose described it like this. He said, taking Megiddo is like capturing 1,000 cities. He realized how important it was to take control over Megiddo, so now he controlled the trade route, and that meant he had financial and military security. I want to jump to the recent history for a moment because it's really interesting to know that the British general Edmund Allenby, during the First World War in 1910, did the exact same thing as Tuthmose III. He had been reading history books. He knew about the Battle of Megiddo, and he remembered this strategic decision of Tuthmose III to take the narrow Aruna pass, Wadi Ara. And so he did the same thing. He took the Turkish soldiers by surprise by coming through Wadi Ara, and then they named him Lord Allenby of Megiddo. So here you can see that you can definitely learn something from the history. But back to the ancient times. So Megiddo was captured by Tuthmose III, but it did not remain in the hands of the Egyptians. According to biblical accounts, the leader of the Israelites, Joshua, captured the city about 70 years later. And archaeological findings show that a new gate and city walls were built around the time of King Solomon. Although there are also scholars who think that this gate is from a bit later time, the time of King Jeroboam, who came after King Solomon. Now, when you visit Megiddo, the first thing that you will see are the two city gates that were excavated. There's a late bronze city gate, the Canaanite city gate, which had 4 chambers. Usually the Canaanite city gates, when you go visit archaeological sites, you see they had 4 chambers. Now it seems like here in Megiddo, the city did not have a wall at the time. So the gate was more of ceremonial importance than of defensive importance. It probably served as an entrance to a palace complex that is right behind the gate and that was also excavated. And this was a huge Canaanite palace. Only one massive stone wall remains of it because the palace was destroyed in a big fire in the middle of the 12th century before Christ. But the excavators did find hundreds of carved ivory artifacts, and that shows that the rulers of that time were very wealthy. Now, when you walk a little bit higher on the Tel, you reach to the Iron Age time gate. This is the Israelite gate. So for a long time, it has been attributed to King Solomon, who is known from the Bible to have been a very powerful ruler. He is always praised for his wisdom and his wealth and his many women. He had about 700 wives and 300 concubines. And he built and constructed several fortified cities. In the Bible, it is mentioned that Solomon built the cities of Hazor, Gezer, and Megiddo. But today's excavators think that the gate was not built by Solomon, but by King Jeroboam about 200 years later. The gate itself had 6 chambers, not 4 like the Canaanites, but 6. The outer gate had 2 chambers. Then you passed through the outer gate. You came into an inner courtyard built in an L shape. A very good strategic way of building, because that meant that if the enemies came into the courtyard, you could attack them from different sides. And then you reached the inner gate, and the inner gate had 6 chambers. This was a much stronger fortified gate than the Canaanite gate. And because the Israelite kings had a lot of horses and chariots, they also had to build a ramp. And until today, you can see that ramp that goes up from the lower part of the Tel up towards the Iron Age time gate. So the horses and chariots had access to the city. And all these horses needed stables. And they found 2 big horse stables on the northern and on the southern side of the Tel, both excavated, and they show that Megiddo became an important base for cavalry and a center for commerce in horses. You can still see the big stones that were hollowed out to serve as mangers for the food. And all these horses needed a lot of food, so when the excavators found a huge grain silo, they imagined that this would serve not only the inhabitants of the city, but also the many horses. You can still see the silo. It is dug into the ground about 7 meters deep, and it has about 11 meters in diameter. The silo's walls are made of small field stones, and then there are 2 staircases on the side of the circle-shaped silo that lead down to the bottom. And in the bottom of this structure, they found kernels of wheat and also remains of straw. And that gave the archaeologists the idea that this was a grain silo, and it could store up to about 1,000 tons of wheat. Another very impressive finding in Megiddo is the huge water system. It was made during the time of the Israelite kings in the Iron Age, and the people realized that their main water source was outside of the city walls, which meant that in case of a siege, when an attacking army would besiege them, they would not be able to reach the water source. So they decided to dig from the inside of the city wall a deep shaft, 36 meters almost straight down. And from there, they did a tunnel 70 meters long, dug out through the rocks to reach to where the water supply was. And the tunnel was cut on an incline so that the water would flow from the spring, from the source, down to the bottom of the shaft. And now the inhabitants could remain in the city and draw water while standing at the top of the shaft, down from underneath the city. On the end of the spring, they had sealed the area with a massive stone, and they covered it with earth so that the enemy would not discover it. In this way, the people in the city could reach their water source without having to get out of the city walls. If you walk up to the top of the Tel, you have an observation point and you look out over the valley. You see the Jezreel Valley, Marj bin Amer, but also from there you can see the deep trench that was dug in 1925 by an excavation team from Chicago. And you can see the many different strata, the many different layers of the more than 20 cities that were built here on top of each other. They excavated down to the bedrock. So that is the first inhabited layer. And it goes back to the 7th century BC. This is the Neolithic period, the Stone Age. When they were digging here, they realized that they had found a cultic area, an area that was used for worship and sacrifices. It had been used from the 4th century BC up until the Iron Age, up until the early Israelite period. They found a huge number of temples. These temples had just been built one on top of the other, and they were all used for worship and sacrifices to the Canaanite gods. From the observation point, when you look down, you look onto a massive circular altar. This dates from the early Canaanite period. It is 8 meters in diameters. You have to walk up 7 steps that lead you to the top of the altar. And the altar was made of a lot of small field stones that were all stapled on top of each other. And the excavators found here a huge number of animal bones. These animal bones were the leftovers of the sacrifices, the animal sacrifices that were done on the altar. It seems that in the early Canaanite period, they performed the rituals in an open area, and then later the whole area was covered with a temple, not a normal temple, but more like a fortress. It had big towers to protect it and big walls. And such tower temples have also been found in other parts of the country. For example, in Tel Balata near Nablus, we see such a temple that was used for sacrifices, but in the same time was protected with a big wall and a tower where people could also hide in times of danger. The city of Megiddo was captured many times. In fact, I read that it was taken in all the famous battles. So despite the fact that it was on a hill and it was surrounded with a wall and with towers, highly fortified, every time it would be attacked, it would fall. And that's probably because the attackers were so convinced that they had to take Megiddo in order to control the area. When the Assyrians captured the city in 732 BC, it became the capital of an Assyrian district that included the Galilee and the northern valleys. And then at the end of the 7th century, it was taken by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho. And for people who know the Bible stories, this was the pharaoh who had King Josiah of Judah killed here at Megiddo. After that, the history of Megiddo kind of finishes in the Persian period. In the 4th century before Christ, during the Persian Empire, there were only a few structures left, and the inhabitants of Megiddo started to move away from the city to live in other places. During the Roman time, the Romans did realize the strategic importance of this location, and they stationed a Roman legion here, the 6th Roman legion, not on the mountain, but on the foot of the mountain. And it had about 5,000 Roman soldiers. It was the biggest encampment outside of Jerusalem, so you can see how important Megiddo still was. Very close to this Roman encampment, there was a village in the 1st century AD, and it was called Kfar Othnai. Now, in the British Mandate time, they built a prison on the ruins of this early Roman village. It seems that the British knew that there were ruins, but they didn't care for excavating it, so they built a prison. And then after the British left and the state of Israel was established, this prison remained, and it was passed on first to the Israeli army and then to the Israeli prison service. And it is a prison where many Palestinian political prisoners are kept. And then more recently, Israel adopted new European standards for minimum space per prisoner. And this prison did not live up to these new standards, so they had to move the prisoners to a new location. And that's when they started to excavate the area of the prison. And that's when they discovered the ruins of this 1st century Roman town, Kfar Othnai. And while they were excavating, they found a huge mosaic carpet, about 54 square meters, in a very good condition. And this mosaic has what is probably the earliest text referring to Jesus as God. It says, "The God-loving Akeptus has offered the table to God Jesus Christ as a memorial." Now, Akeptus is believed to be the name of a woman who paid money for a communion table that was probably serving for the Eucharist ceremony, when they break the bread and they drink the wine. The mosaic floor also had features of fish, and this is also considered an early Christian symbol. So this is an important finding, because the mosaic floor was found inside a room that was probably a residential room, but was used as a place where Christians would gather together. A sort of early church, but not an official church building, a public building, because in that time Christianity was still a forbidden religion in the Roman Empire. And these kind of early house churches where people would gather in a house, they were quite common in early Christian time. They were secret churches. For example, in Capernaum, near the Lake of Galilee, where Jesus used to stay in Peter's house, there seems to have been there also a gathering place before the first official church was built after Emperor Constantine, approved of the Christian religion. Now, it's very interesting for scholars that this early Christian meeting place near Megiddo was found so close to a Roman legion camp, because this may mean that despite the stories of persecution of early Christians by the Romans, there may also have been places like this that were tolerated. And we know that even some Romans converted to Christianity. Don't forget the Bible story that tells that a Roman centurion in Caesarea had his whole family baptized after the Apostle Peter came from Joppa to Caesarea. Remember, I shared this on the episode about Caesarea. So even though we know that Christians were persecuted in the early Roman time, it may also mean that it wasn't that black and white, the history. Now, Megiddo is usually identified as the Armageddon of the New Testament book of Revelation. And in this book, which is the last book of the Bible, you can read the prophetic visions of the writer of the book. He calls himself John, although scholars don't know who is this John actually. And I'm not a theologian, so I will not try to explain or even understand the story of that book. But it involves many creatures, a seven-headed dragon, a serpent, a beast, angels, and scholars even do not agree if this is a book because it's an ancient book, so maybe it refers to events that already happened in the past. Several scholars say that it was a prophecy about the fall of the Roman Empire, though there are other scholars that think that it is still a futuristic scene and it still has to happen. So in this book, it's written that this will happen in Armageddon. And when you visit Megiddo, you will find Christian tour guides and pastors at the observation point overlooking the Jezreel Valley, explaining to the visitors that this is the place where the final battle between armies in the end of time is going to take place. And after that battle will be the second coming of Jesus. Now, the name Armageddon can be read in the book of Revelation in chapter 16, verse 16 also. And most scholars agree that this word, Armageddon, is a corruption of the Hebrew Har Megiddo. Har means mountain, the mountain of Megiddo. And with such a long history of battles and such an important strategic place, it is not a surprise that the author of the book of Revelation would have taken Har Megiddo as the location for the final apocalyptic battle. And that's all I wanted to say about Megiddo. And if you ever come to visit Palestine, you can visit Tel Megiddo. It is about an hour and a half drive from Jerusalem and about half an hour drive from Nazareth in the Jezreel Valley. Thank you for listening to Stories from Palestine. If you enjoy the podcast, then here are several things you can do to support the show. Tell your friends about the podcast. Share some of the social media posts on Instagram or Facebook. Start following the YouTube channel. You can also hear the podcast audio there. And soon I will start uploading videos. Sign up for the email list so that you get a reminder with a clickable link to the new podcast episode. And in the future, you will be updated about programs and trips that I will start to organize. And of course, you can donate to help me pay for hosting the podcast and the website and all the related recording costs. It's the only source of income I have at the moment, so you can imagine how much I appreciate every cup of coffee or falafel sandwich that you buy me on the Ko-fi platform. All the links that you need can be found in the show notes and on the website storiesfrompalestine.info. That's it. I hope you will tune in again next week. If you enjoy listening to Stories from Palestine podcast, then I think you will also enjoy listening to my favorite podcast, which is called Jerusalem Unplugged. You can find it on most podcast players and on social media at Jerusalem Unplugged.